So we're talking about the holiness of God, common questions that Christians could have about the holiness of God. And the second question for this week is, what is holiness anyway? And it's very important that we define holiness right, the holiness of God right, because if we're just like 30 degrees off on holiness, then we're going to end up somewhere that we don't want to be way down the road, because so much of our theology is built upon the holiness of God, the atonement, the understanding of sanctification, the church, as the church is the holy church. A whole lot of our theology is built upon the holiness of God, and if we're off a little bit in our initial conception of it, we might only be a little bit off, but eventually we're going to get way back in a place that we don't want to be. Now, it's kind of like you're driving a car and the steering wheel is a little bit off. It may not look like much at first, but eventually you're going to be back somewhere you don't want to be and run into a lot of things in the process. So what is the holiness of God? The idea of holiness in itself is the idea of consecration and devotion. Being utterly consecrated to something, devoted to something. We see this in Scripture. When Moses sees the burning bush, God says, take off your sandal because the ground that you're on is holy ground. And what does that mean, it's holy ground? Well, it doesn't mean that Moses can't be there, because actually God has invited him to be there. The ground is a place for the fellowship between God and man, but it is holy ground, meaning it is ground consecrated and devoted to God. And Moses takes off his sandal as a symbol of sort of depossessing himself, like Boaz asked the other kinsman redeemer, the possible kinsman redeemer, to take off his sandal as a way of depossessing himself. So the whole idea there of Moses is that he is recognizing that this land is devoted to God, and Moses is devoting himself to God as well, consecrating himself unto God. So holiness is consecration and devotion. Now, if we say that God is holy, we immediately run into somewhat of a problem, because what does it mean that God is consecrated unto something? And how can he possibly be consecrated to something before the creation of the world, when God was all alone? Well, but to ask the question that way is to reveal the flaw in the question. God was never alone. God was always with himself as the triune being. God is never alone. He always has this intimate, wonderful fellowship in Trinity. So holiness for God then is ultimately the utter devotion and consecration of the Father to the Son to the Father, and so on and so forth, within the Trinity. God's holiness is God's utter consecration and devotion to himself that is expressed in the terms of the Trinity. One theologian puts it very well. Johannes Voss says that holiness is that attribute of God by which he seeks and loves himself as the highest good, and demands that creatures be consecrated unto him. You see, because God is utterly consecrated unto himself as the highest good, creatures who he has made must be consecrated unto him. So holiness for God is the consecration unto himself, and that requires us to be consecrated and devoted to him.